A very good morning to you all, and a very warm welcome to the IISS. For the purposes of the recording today, my name is Antoine Levesque. I'm a research associate for South Asia here at the IISS. We meet today to discuss India's maritime security in the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific. This theme runs through many of the discussions we hold at the ISS on Asia's changing strategic landscape in general, and India's foreign and security policy in particular. So I'm delighted that we have a full hour ahead of us today to do justice to that topic. Today, India is taking unprecedented steps to bolster its role as a major maritime power in keeping with its globalizing interests. The Indian Ocean does, in many ways, remain the Indian Navy's primary area of interest. Yet, under Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India, India's foreign policy and security policies, maritime diplomacy and naval activities have embraced the Indo-Pacific, a much broader geographical and geopolitical canvas, which Prime Minister Modi himself has referred to, and which his Defence Minister discussed in some detail at last year's ISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. The Indian Navy's latest doctrine, meanwhile, the 2015 Maritime Security Strategy, also used the Indo-Pacific as its explicit frame of reference while receiving unprecedented backing from the country's political leadership. This heralds a more cooperative and active Indian Navy in the Indo-Pacific region. So altogether, these changes prompt many questions. How can India play the role of a net security provider in the Indian Ocean? How will China's growing presence there affect India's thinking on maritime issues? How does India relate to Japan, Vietnam, and other countries east of Malacca in relation to maritime security? One day after the US National Security Advisor visited New Delhi, can we expect US-India maritime ties to be both influenced and shape India's maritime and naval policies? To address these policy-relevant issues and questions, it's my great pleasure to welcome back to the ISS Dr. Satu Limaye. As a director at the East-West Center in Washington and senior advisor at the Center for Naval Analysis, Dr. Limaye is an accomplished scholar of naval and maritime affairs in the Asia-Pacific. Besides a long association with the US Pacific Command, I would just highlight that he is the author of two recently published reports, one on the Indian Navy's new maritime strategy capabilities and diplomacy, and he's also the co-author of another report last February on the future of US-India naval relations. Dr. Limaye will speak in his personal capacity today for about 20 to 25 minutes, after which we will open for discussion. I remind you that this entire discussion today is on the record. With this, Dr. Limaye, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Antoine, and a pleasure to be back at IISS. I spent a little bit of time here when I was a grad student many decades ago, but it's been a long time since I've spoken here, so it's a grand opportunity. I'm looking forward to your input and questions as well. Look, I got 25 minutes, so let me just cut to the chase. The Center for Naval Analysis did a set of 3 studies. The first one, which I'm primarily focusing on, is called Weighted West, focused on the Indian Ocean and cooperating across the Indo-Pacific. The publicly releasable version is on the CNA website. You're free to just download it or get it if you'd like. It's a companion study with the study Antoine mentioned on U.S. and India naval cooperation, where we've been, where we're going, and some scenarios that we're looking at. And the third study looks very detailed from some legal colleagues at CNA on the legal elements of our agreements like LMOA and the military information sharing and what have you. I'm not an legal expert on those, but those are the 3 studies, and I know that's a lot of stuff, but even if you read the executive summaries, it's worth looking at if you're seriously interested. Very detailed assessment of where we are and where we might be going. On India, Antoine captured it, I thought, really perfectly, which is this sort of question is, where is India going with its naval strategy? And so I spent a few months really trying to do an intersection between what was stated in the strategy, what the capabilities are, and when you deconstruct this in sort of very rigorous data and analytical terms, where you get. And what I'd like to do in my time here is just give you the punchlines, in other words, the sort of net assessment of where I think India is going and why that's so meaningful for U.S.-India Navy cooperation. The first is that it is very interesting that India has put out two strategies in roughly 10 years' time, and a lot has happened in the region, but particularly to India. And I can talk about a few of those things, but the ones I think that jump out most importantly are India's widening set of interests, concentric to India. The second is the terrorist attacks of 2008, which were, I think, extraordinarily important because they came from the sea. And the third is the ongoing incremental evolution of India's naval capabilities. And the fourth, and I think one of the more interesting elements, is the tie-in between the Indian Navy and the Ministry of External Affairs, and how the Indian Maritime Strategy and Indian naval deployments and engagement become part of MEA strategy, or at least consistent or coherent with Indian naval strategy. So let me lay this out. The 2015 strategy does really, first and foremost, because it's a document to guide the Indian Navy behavior, Navy operations, I think the most important thing is it reprioritizes and reformulates what those missions are. And I think it does them in rather interesting ways that we didn't see in the 2007. I would just simply note the title of the two strategies. The first one was called Freedom to Use the Seas. Quite frankly, I don't want to get very, wordsmithy about this, but freedom to use the seas is a very passive sort of doctrine. It's, like any state, the ability to use international waters. The 2015 strategy is called Ensuring Secure Seas. It's active. It's a deliberate effort to shape a maritime environment. Not quite in the way that maybe the U.S. would use the word shape, but sort of very activist and less passive. What are the main reprioritizations and reformulation of Indian Navy missions? First, it's very interesting that deterrence is moved to the first priority and warfighting to the second. This suggests that India's Navy's warfighting mission is obviously there for any military service, but deterrence is the first priority. And we can go into details about why that's the case. The second is that the standalone mission to support UN missions is gone. It's eliminated from the strategy, which suggests, again, a more activist and ad hoc ability for India to make decisions about who they want to work with and why. It doesn't have to be, implicitly, doesn't have to be a UN mission. Thirdly, it combines a coastal and an offshore security strategy, which is somewhat unusual in Navy and maritime terms. And fourthly, unlike in the past when India used to have constabulary, diplomatic, and benign roles, these roles of the Navy are put into the strategies for deterrence, conflict, and a new chapter called Shaping a Positive Maritime Environment, which relates directly to India's aspirational role or planned role to be a net security provider. And finally, I would note that India also does a couple of other things that are worth noting. It lays out its definition of net security provider. And for us in the United States, this is very important because we used a definition of a net provider of security in our 2012 DoD strategic guidance. The Indians have reformulated that slightly. And while we're not quite clear exactly what our Indian colleagues mean by that, they at least provide us a very clear view of their thinking about it, and it's implicit in the document. It's included in an Indian National Security Strategy document, and that I think is a milestone. Another factor I would just highlight is that the strategy goes at some length to talk about cooperative relationships and institutions. And if you correlate this with the recent DoD report, MOD report in India, you'll notice small things, but interesting things, like the second year running that they have participated in the ADMM, which is the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting plus maritime workshop and maritime exercises. And then the final thing, which goes to the heart of what Antoine spoke about, is India really interested in an Indo-Pacific strategy? Is it interested in an Indian Ocean strategy? Where is the geographic focus for this new mission and roles? And what's interesting is if you compare the 2007 and 2015 strategies, India has reformulated what its geographic interests are in some quite telling ways, which allow us to think about why they did it and what that means, and you can also marry it up with the capabilities. So let me turn to that. I come back to any of these points that you want, but I wanted to focus particularly not very much on capabilities and a lot more on, I think, some of the more interesting bits, which is where is India's priorities? As this suggests, there's three elements, as the title has, and it's very deliberate. There's a maritime strategy, which is weighted very much to the west. There's capabilities, which are essentially focused on the Indian Ocean. And there's diplomacy, which is across the Indo-Pacific. In other words, if you read it backwards, another way of saying this is, I don't think India will be operationally deployed across the Indo-Pacific, but its diplomacy will increasingly be across the Indo-Pacific. Its focus will be on the Indian Ocean. Means for India, that means the neighborhood, but also the southwestern island regions of Seychelles, Mauritius, etc. To some extent, the eastern coast of Africa, and heavily focused on the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, as might be expected. And that will be the prime focus. So there's very much this debate about Indo-Pacific, and it's captured by both, that the capabilities and the focus of strategy will be in the Indian Ocean and weighted towards the west, and that its diplomacy will be Indo-Pacific. And you see that with the naval chief's visit to Malaysia this past week, for example, as an example of that. So why do I say weighted west? Let me try to explain that, because people always ask me, well, what do you mean by India's Navy's weighted west? I'll try to explain exactly what that means. If you deconstruct where India's interests are and what drives Indian national interests, but also naval interests, you'll find that it's heavily weighted towards the west in the following ways. First, energy. It's not only that India imports, I'm sorry, I completely just lost that section. Right, here we are. So if you look at India's geography in 2007 and how they characterize it, the primary areas of interest were the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal, the island countries, which is what I refer to, Seychelles, Mauritius, etc., Persian Gulf, and the principal sea lanes. What's very interesting about ensuring secure seas, the more recent strategy, is in addition to the coastal zones, which are number one, which are added to the 2007 strategy, they add the Andaman Sea, they add the Gulf of Oman, the Gulf of Aden, and the Red Sea. They add specifically the Southwest Indian Ocean, including IOR islands, nations therein, and east coast of Africa and littoral regions. And they add choke points. In other words, if you see the primary, Indian Navy separates out its geographic interests by primary and secondary. All of the primary interests of geography for the Indian Navy now are weighted more towards the west than they are towards the east. And for those of us working on East Asia in the United States, it's noticeable that East Asia and Southeast Asia still remain in the secondary areas of India's interest, but now have moved from second position to first position, which we can come back to. I know this is a little bit of, it'd be easier with a map. The other thing to note, interestingly, since Indian naval deployments this week were in Greece, that they've added the Mediterranean Sea and the west coast of Africa for the first time to their strategy, which didn't exist in the previous strategy, which is something that's well worth looking at. Now, what else drives India to the west? First, if you look at their energy portfolio, you can see that India's energy imports, of course, are reliance on the Middle East and increasingly Eastern Africa, which is why I think Prime Minister Modi went to Mozambique for the first time, for example. It also has something to do with the Mozambique Channel, where an Indian fishing ship was hijacked. And it also has something to do with what other ships could go through the Mozambique Channel from other countries. So you see a very much a deliberate focus on Eastern Africa, highlighted through the prime ministerial visits. But one interesting thing that rarely gets mentioned, it's not only India's energy imports coming in, but it's Indian petroleum, oil, and lubricant projects going out. In other words, that the crude oil that India brings in, which it refines in its refineries and creates petroleum, oil, and lubricants packages of exports, go increasingly to the west of India. In other words, what we would consider the west, which is the Middle East, Eastern Africa. It does not go to the east. The other factor that makes it increasingly west is that if you look at the sea lanes, and if you look at where Indian deployments have increased, Indian naval stations, in the 6 degree channel, for example, and the 9 degree channel, etc., India appears to have more control over its immediate neighborhood. In other words, Indian capabilities and ability to monitor its immediate neighborhood have improved, which allows them to extend further west and east as well. If you look at the choke points, of all the choke points that are in the primary areas of India's stated interests are to the west, not to the east. So if you deconstruct the choke points, the ones that matter most are in the west. Though they've added ones like Sunda and ones that I'd never heard of, quite frankly, like Ombai and Watar in Indonesia. But if you look at the depth gauges of those straits and others, there's some very interesting results about what can flow through those straits. But they're not in the primary areas of interest. Third, India's maritime boundaries. Of all of India's maritime boundaries, only one is unsettled. It's in the west, and it's with Pakistan, which will tell you exactly why I think that focus is there. If you look at trade, people keep talking about Indian trade, but what's very interesting is if you break down Indian trade, it's overwhelmingly to the west, which means that the sea lines and trade shipments are still to the west. Fourth, if you look at Indian Navy deployments and Indian maritime interests in piracy, counter-piracy, they're to the west. India has been active. I think the last MOD statement had 81 ships in counter-piracy operations. Of course, not in the combined maritime forces that the U.S. has, but through their own maritime patrolling. The other area is foreign direct investment. If you look at foreign direct investment, it doesn't really matter for the Navy per se, but India is still very heavily weighted towards the West in where its investment comes from. Now that will trade with the Mauritius Tax Treaty, which is scheduled to be renegotiated in 3 years, but it's an interesting fact. If you look at HADR and NEO operations that India has conducted over the last decade, they're all in the West, except HADR operations, which are in South Asia and to some extent Southeast Asia. Now, it's fair to say that you do NEOs and you do HADRs where they're required. You don't do them out of choice. That's quite true, but it links to another factor, which is most of India's diaspora population of Indian citizens is to the west. It's not in the east. So if you go through these factors, I just wanted to highlight them specifically, that if you deconstruct India's profile on energy, trade, investment, exports, imports, maritime boundaries, where ships have sailed, where private vessels sail, where Indian private sector business interests are headquartered, you get a very heavily Western bias. This does not mean India cannot act in the East. It simply means that India's primary interests are weighted in the West, and that's where India will be focused. Now, on the geostrategic front, the other factor to also note is that while from the Indian perspective they write a lot about PLA and into the Indian Ocean, the unresolved issues with Pakistan mean that India also has to be aware of the Pakistani Navy capabilities and the relationship between the People's Liberation Army Navy of China and the Pakistani Navy, which also gives an impetus to look towards the West. What does that mean for India in the Indo-Pacific strategy? And I'm 2 minutes from the end of my time. One thing I think it means is that for India, the East China Sea and the South China disputes are important precursors to American behavior and to Chinese behavior, but they are not directly vested interests in either of those disputes. Second, India's capabilities to play a role in any of the maritime major disputes that the U.S. is interested in, Korean Peninsula, cross straits, East China Sea, or South China Sea, are not ones in which India has a primary or particular interest, legal, sovereign, or territorial. Third, what is uncertain is where does India play a role in terms of being a net security provider in the Indo-Pacific? I think it means the following three things. One, it means that India is likely to be more interested in working on capacity building and working with like navies in the region, whether it be Malaysia or Japan or Australia, and you can already see that. Second, I think India would like to very much cooperate more with us, with the United States, I should say, in terms of the AFRICOM and the CENTCOM theaters of maritime operations. Right now, because India is in our Pacific Command military structure, our cooperation is heavily focused on maritime cooperation in the Indian Ocean, east of India, and with the Malabar exercises, and of course the India, Australia, Japan exercises. But in the future, we can think more seriously about working with India in AFRICOM and working with India in CENTCOM. It's something to be negotiated between the two countries. So all this leaves us with is, I think that we are on the cusp of some very significant juncture at which to think about opportunities to cooperate more broadly with India and differently with India. Now, there are scenarios under which that cooperation may be more or less likely, and we can discuss those. But I'll leave with one final thing, which I mentioned at the outset about diplomacy. It occurs to me that in East Asia and Southeast Asia, Indian Navy role so far tends to be a diplomatic role and a defense diplomacy role rather than an operational role. And I do not see in the near term India playing an operational role in terms of getting involved in regional conflicts or having a stake in regional outcomes in that way, rather than in a generic net security provider such as HADR, such as maritime domain awareness, such as joint patrolling and joint cooperative exercises through regional organizations such as ADMM+. So let me stop there, and then we can take it up. It leaves me at exactly 20 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. We now have just over 30 minutes for discussion. Maybe I should start with my own question to you. You've now very clearly set for us a scene where India is focusing both eastward and westward. I think you've put to us very clearly that there is no obvious contradiction between those two outlooks. Do you think that there is a possibility for India to continue conciliating those two outlooks in the foreseeable future in a way which does not pose any political or policy contradictions, or is there a moment when those two outlets may need to be prioritized in some way? Mm-hmm. I'm deliberately using the word outlook when you distinguished outlook from interests and capabilities, but it seems to me that that this is a fundamental sort of ambiguity in India's whole of government stance, and I wonder if you think that is a tenable stance in the long term.
Well, thank you. If you look at the report, you'll notice that one thing I tried to do in some great detail is to map out the primary and secondary areas of India's maritime and navy interests. It's very easily readable on a chart on page 37, which is the Navy chart of its interests and the Indian Ministry of External Affairs interests. And what you'll see is an extreme correlation, more than there was in the 2007 document, about what was the primary interest. So I think that the outlook is expansive. In fact, India is getting to have a much more expansive outlook. I would say that there are two ways to think about this. There's a Navy way to think about it, and there's an Indian national policy way to look at it. Indian national policy has become increasingly Indo-Pacific because India is now a member of all the East Asian and Pacific regional organizations, except the economic ones, like APEC and TPP, etc. And second, India now has better relations across Southeast Asia and East Asia than it's ever had. I mean, 10 years ago, you couldn't have done this with Japan. India could not have done this with Japan. India could not have done this with Australia. India could not have done ADMM with Southeast Asia. As you'll recall, at least in 3 times in modern post-1945 history, India has been seen as a naval threat in the East Asia. One in the late 60s and early 70s, second in the early 90s after the end of the Cold War. So there is some change in that perspective in East Asia. And again, most of my life has been spent in East Asia, working from Japan and looking outward. So India has been seen as very much a faraway, distant power in the East Asian context. But now it is integrated both bilaterally and in regional institutions. However, the contingency of what will shape that outlook, I think, will be the following 3 factors. 1, how does India and Pakistan get along? In other words, will their continuing difficulties in their relationship move India from a focus on East Asia back to a more South Asia focus and land focus with a maritime component that may be slightly subsidiary to the land focus? That's one. And the second variable, I think, that will affect Indian behavior on these 2 outlooks, this broad outlooks versus the more narrow outlook, will be how quickly does Indian capacity develop? And as you know, and as Indians themselves write, that capacity building dynamic is one that is incremental rather than revolutionary. In other words, India is slowly building up capabilities, but they have difficulties of time delays and technical problems and mishaps on ships and the submarine accidents and what have you. So really, I think it depends on capabilities versus its relationship. Now, the obvious answer to that is, what about China coming into the Indian Ocean? And my answer is very simple. If China's coming into the Indian Ocean, it reinforces the Indian Ocean focus of the Indian Navy. It doesn't expand India's focus, because India has at current fewer tools to work with in terms of money and other tools, even in South Asia. So whether it's OBOR or PLAN, naval expansion and modernization, India is still running at some deficit in the ability. Of course, India also has lots of maritime advantages. This is, as it were, its home waters. It's its home turf. So it has a lot of advantages in Sri Lanka, in the relationship, as we saw last week, with Bangladesh, etc. So I'm not saying that India is in jeopardy, but if China expands its naval focus into the Indian Ocean even more, I think India will be compelled to play even more of a role in the near abroad rather than in the East Asia and Southeast Asia sphere.
Thank you. The first person to catch my eye was Mr. Mohammed Ali.
Thank you. Dr. Limaye, thanks very much for sharing your insights. First question that I'd ask is, you have talked about India's perspective shaped to an extent by its relationship with the United States and China, somewhat different. U.S.-China relations have changed in the past. In the 1970s, they became very different to what had preceded that. At that time, India's role was somewhat marginalized. If U.S.-China relations change again under the Trump administration, I wonder whether you see any changes in India's position or perception in terms of its defensive national interests. And secondly, I wonder if you could tell us something about India's naval leg of its own nuclear triad that it's building, where that fits in all that you have studied in your report. Thank you.
Sure. On U.S.-China, yeah, you're quite right in saying that the U.S. relationship changed in the early 70s. I wish I could tell you what's going to happen under our current administration. I don't know. I'll tell you the following things I think I do know. One is that we are no closer to working out a framework for the U.S.-China agreement under President Trump as we were under the previous three administrations. What is that? Under the 72 Nixon-Kissinger element, we had at least a framework, and the framework was very simple: normalization, from non-recognition and non-official relations to normalization and some cooperation. Subsequently, we've tried many different frameworks to frame the U.S.-China agreement. Framework 1, responsible stakeholder. Framework 2, G2, which is the sort of condominium. Framework 3, strategic reassurance. Framework 4, suggested by our Chinese friends, new model of great power relations. The fact is, none of these work. So, point 1 is that we don't have a framework for working out the relationship. Point 2, the U.S.-China relationship is now, I think, predicated on a trend line of increasing strategic distrust on both sides. 3, I think the U.S.-China relationship is now seeing a level of contestation over power, over the balance of power, over the balance of relations in Asia, not globally, but in Asia certainly, and about order. What rules, norms, and institutions will work? That's point 3. Point 4 is that the U.S.-China relationship is now so big, it is, if you will, and it's not a pejorative or a positive thing, it is too big to fail. Neither the U.S. or China, in my view, want the relationship to fail. So India's position in this context is as follows, which is precisely the same as every other country. I don't speak about Europe, I don't know enough, or Latin America or South America, but at least in Asia, is that almost every capital in Asia wants the U.S.-China relationship to be Goldilocks right. Not too hot, not too cold. And the question is, where's the right fit? Neither Seoul, nor Tokyo, nor Kuala Lumpur, nor Jakarta, I dare say not even Pyongyang, wants the relationship to be too bad or too good, because it reduces their maneuvering space and creates incredible pressures on them from one side or the other. And they'd like to avoid that. I think India's in that same space. India does not want a U.S.-China relationship that is conflictual. It will put India in a very difficult position. I think India would also not welcome a U.S.-China relationship that is entirely a condominium, because that will put India in a difficult position. So on China, I would say that we're roughly where we want to be, but the trend lines are more negative than positive, is how I'd put it. On your question about the Arihant and the Indian nuclear triad, Simple fact is, in the public source domain, I don't know. Clearly, India is seeking to develop a triad. How quickly that will go, when those elements will be in place, how that will be integrated with the overall nuclear deterrence and strategic stability posture of India, simply don't know. But this study does speak to India's nuclear capabilities, and it suggests that they're on track to develop that element of the triad. I'm simply unable to say, in a knowledgeable way, whether that's going to take 5 years or 10 years or where that will stop. I think it will very much depend on how India's nuclear posture develops and how much emphasis they decide to give to the sea-based element of that triad as opposed to the other elements of the triad.
I should add on this that the 2015 Maritime Security Doctrine actually has quite a lot of detail on nuclear-related matters. Doesn't address them particularly strongly head-on, but there's a glossary, for example, of terms which include a number of nuclear-related references. And of course, there is also a broad reference to deterrence being in conventional terms to the Indian Navy, which permeates the whole document, and then includes
the
nuclear strategic aspect of deterrence also. The next person to catch my eye was the gentleman on the second row there. Could you please tell us who you are?
Yes, Chris Alden, International Relations Department at London School of Economics. And I wanted to ask, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to pick up one of the themes that you put forward, which is the link, the way you presented the naval interests were very much intertwined with commercial activities and all of that sort of thing. If I think about how the Chinese have approached, and East Africa, I'm more knowledgeable about Southern and Eastern Africa, they've been very forthright in linking in development finance interests. The Djibouti basing was about, it's often spoken of in purely military terms, but read from the Djibouti perspective, it's about a special economic zone, it's an industrial park, it's about development finance and the like. Similar arrangements been put forward in Tanzania. It's interesting that Mozambique, which India has had a historically closer relationship than if you were to compare these things, China was close to Tanzania, has been close to Tanzania, and Mozambique has been more oriented positively towards India. Is there any sense that this linking of the development demands, as it were, of the African countries are going to form part of a package that India will use to attract and embed themselves more readily into those countries like Mozambique?
Is there an idea? Yes. Short answer is yes, there's an Indian idea of doing that. I would just refer you to the new MEA budget under the new Indian national budget. It's a very curious document to link to naval strategy, but it's worth saying something about because it tells you how much India's focus is still very much Indian Ocean centric and neighborhood centric. Second, how to use this language, how minimal the Indian capabilities for defense and development work is in terms of the amount of money that they're giving. And thirdly, how unclear that it's integrated to naval and maritime interests. Let me give you an example. Forgive me for reading these numbers, but they're quite useful. So if you look at the 2017-2018 Indian fiscal budget, only 10 countries are specifically named as recipients of project aid. Okay? Of these 10 countries, only 6 are Indian Ocean countries. Right? Littoral countries. Second, the allocation of that aid presents an extraordinarily mixed commitment to the infrastructure that China is doing through OBOR and other means. For example, if you look and deconstruct the funding that MEA is getting for these aid projects, the actual amount of aid has declined by 14% from the previous 2016-17 budget. Second, the single biggest recipient by a factor of, I think, 10 is Bhutan, which is not relevant to India's maritime and naval strategy. And the next biggest priorities are also for Afghanistan and Nepal, which are also landlocked and not relevant to India's maritime and naval strategy. There are a couple of things worth noting. There's an Indian Ocean bias in some ways also, which links to the issue of what the PLAN will do in the region, which is as follows. One, there's going to be a massive increase to the Maldives, Seychelles, and Mauritius. Second, for the first time, Chabahar Port has a line item. So if you deconstruct it, it's still heavily land-oriented, not maritime. It's an overall decline in budget. But 4 countries, Maldives, Seychelles, Mauritius, and Iran, are now slated to implement the 4 agreements that Modi signed during his trip to Iran, which suggests a link on the Navy strategy to the West on infrastructure development for the first time. Now, what's very interesting is what Japan and India are planning to do together in infrastructure development. Because one of the things that, if you look at what India and Japan are agreeing to do, it may well be that India and Japan pool resources across the southwestern islands. It should not escape notice that Prime Minister Abe also made a tour of East Africa for the first time for a Japanese Prime Minister. Maybe after 30 years or 20, whatever, after a long time or for the first time, just as Prime Minister Modi did. So I think you will begin to see more collaboration between Tokyo and Delhi on East Africa. And now that Japan is increasing its capabilities in Djibouti, including the deployment both of 2 ships. Now there's controversy in Tokyo about this too. You'll see some movement. So I hope that helps a little bit. But India is very much, India simply doesn't have the capital or the extra infrastructure given its domestic infrastructure needs and its limitations on financial resources.
Thank you. We now have a quarter of an hour to time. The next 2 people on my list are Desmond Bowen and the gentleman on the second row. Desmond.
Desmond Bowen, I'm a IISS member. I'd just like to have a couple of questions. One is about this capacity and the linkage you interestingly make between the Indian Navy's ambitions, intentions, and the MEA and the foreign policy intent, and how much money goes into that. I mean, it's interesting that I think the Indian, actually, the body of diplomats that India has is quite extraordinarily small for the vast country that it is. So there is a question about capacity. And the question that I really have is about Indian Navy capacity. I mean, Indian military procurement has not been either speedy or efficient. If your focus is security of the seas, you actually have to have presence. You have to have grey hulls, not just capacity building and nice words. So there's a question about just how effective the acquisition is of relevant platforms, and in that, I mean, there's a question about the allocation as between the 3 services. I mean, not a frankly beautiful kind of construct inside the Indian government in terms of how the allocation of resources goes. So, I mean, is the Indian Navy really on the up in terms of allocation of resources? And the second thing is, I mean, you talked about India being in a better position than maybe ever before in terms of its relationships beyond the Straits of Malacca with organisations, groups, membership, presence, and so forth. I mean, the question that I have is what does India have in mind in terms of either creating, dominating, adhering to structures for the Indian Ocean? I mean, is this just how, I mean, I think there are lots of bits of kind of machinery. Are there particular bits that are practical, effective, and enable India to, as it were, deliver on its strategy?
Thank you. Gentleman on the second row.
Yeah, my name is Amar Naina. I'm a student at King's College London. My question is regarding, these are two themes which I've recently read about. One is a very influential strategic affairs expert in India, Brett Bernard. He talks about something known as an Indian Monroe Doctrine. So, talking about a sphere of influence from the Caspian to the Central Asian republics, all the way down to the Bay of Bengal. So, how is that really? I mean, how can it materialize in the lieu of India's naval strategy and its outlook? And even when we talk about the security diamond, I mean, between Australia, India, Japan, US, that's more East focused. So how does that fit in, as you say now, the Indian Navy's approach is more towards the West. So how does all this play about?
Okay, try to link these. They're not wildly dissimilar. On capacity of both IN, Indian Navy, and MEA, I tried to say gently, but let me be more clear. India has capability shortcomings, operational mishaps, limited budget, aging equipment, cost and schedule overruns. Let's leave it at that. This matters if India is going to play an Indo-Pacific role. So let me also be very blunt about that. I don't think India is going to play an Indo-Pacific role. I don't think it aspires to play an operational Indo-Pacific role. But India will still remain a significant navy in Indian Ocean terms because of the Indian Ocean littoral countries. Now, I don't think you can compare the Indian Navy with the US Navy or the Japanese Navy or PLAN, for example. But I think India's capability enhancements with all the procurement and development problems and the mishaps and the accidents and the submarine sinkings and what have you, is still on an incremental upward trajectory. And whether it's big landing craft or destroyers or other ships, they will continue to probably move on a gradual slope upwards. Again, it's all straitjacketed into this larger Indian problem is the economy is not growing as much as it could or should, and India doesn't have the financial resources given all of the other competing elements. Which leads to the question of the Indian Navy's budget in the tri-service allocation. I just don't see the Indian Navy getting a huge plus-up. In any case, as you know, none of the services use all their capital accounts fully each year. So they're unused portions of that budget because they don't fulfill their capital development requirements. I do think that if India Navy bureaucratically works more with MEA, and MEA continues to build up its Southeast Asia and East Asia relationships, which is the biggest place for them to develop relationships in the new Asia-Pacific order, then the Indian Navy might be able to make a slightly larger claim on resources because it's dovetailed with the MEA. Will that work? I don't know. It goes back to Antoine's question at the beginning, is what could derail that process? What could derail that process is some problems within the Indian Ocean or to its west, particularly with Pakistan, that would revert its gaze back to the home turf, as it were. So I think that's possible. Right. And on the East Asia dominating creating structures, India is a rule taker in the East Asian organizations. It's not trying to shape EAS. It's not trying to shape ADMM. It's not trying to shape ARF. It's not trying to shape any of the East Asian organizations. Where India is trying to play more of a role, as you know, is in the institutions in the Indian Ocean. Indian Ocean Navy Symposium, which it started in 2008, and to some lesser extent in the Indian Ocean Regional Association. What is puzzling to me is it's not clear that India has an institutional vision for the Indian Ocean, because Prime Minister Modi has given now 3 speeches, one in Mauritius and one at the February 2016 Fleet Review, in which he's articulated 2 different visions of the Indian Ocean. but they're primarily not institutional. They're India's Indian Ocean strategy. So will they try to use IONS and IORA? Probably, but I think they'll probably more likely use relationships with the United States and with regional countries rather than any institutional structure. I'm not sure that India is looking for an institutional structure. Remember, India's East Asia strategy, the Look East policy or the Act East policy, was predicated fundamentally as a defensive posture in 1991 to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was not a strategic forward presence. It was a defensive movement to not be isolated out of NAFTA and the EU of the time, right? Once the Soviet Union collapsed. So India gradually joined East Asian organizations because it couldn't join any others, right? And it made sense as their relations with Tokyo and Canberra and ASEAN countries improved. They were able to be invited to those other organizations. On Monroe Doctrine, I haven't a clue how India intends to have a Monroe Doctrine in the Indian Ocean. Since the U.S. has access at Diego Garcia. I don't know what that would mean. As an American, we have particular views of what the Monroe Doctrine means. Does that mean that India has consent? India has consent rights into who comes into the Indian Ocean, which is international waters. I'm not quite sure what that means.
As that being a sphere of responsibility of the Indian Navy with the U.S. Navy?
Well, if it wants to be a net security provider, that's in our strategic documents. Exactly what that means, I'm not sure. So I can't answer that question because I don't know what India means by a Monroe Doctrine. And I would think they would find some maritime figure of their own to call it a different name than an American 18th century leader. The security diamond is a Japanese proposition. What's very curious about the security diamond, as you know from Prime Minister Abe's document on it, which he wrote in Project Syndicate, is that it leaves out Southeast Asia. And U.S., Australia, Japan, India cannot be an answer for Japan given its Sino-Japanese rivalry in Southeast Asia. So to me, the security diamond always... The one thing that's very clear, there's only one thing clear about Prime Minister Abe since 2000, his two successive prime ministerships. One is that India is a key articulation. And what is more is that for Japan, whether it's the DPJ government or the LDP government, India remains a centerpiece of the evolution of Japanese security, defense, and foreign policy. How important it is relative to others, that's a debatable point, but India clearly remains a key element.
Thank you. We only have 5+ minutes left. I'd like to fit in the last 3 questions I have spotted in the audience, starting with the gentleman at the end, then the gentleman next to the window, and then my colleague Viraj Solanki.
Hi, Aditya Dave from Royal United Services Institute. I completely agree with you about India's focus being towards the west currently rather than the east. Given certain developments, do you think there's a long-term stress? There will be a long-term tension, long-term stress on movement to the east, given the increasing importance of Japan with their version of the civil nuclear agreement, with Japan's involvement in Chabahar, with increasing trade relations with Southeast Asian countries, with the recent also Australian resumption of uranium imports, and also close alignment with the US. So in the short term, of course, I think 100% India is going to be focused on the West. Do you think in the long term there's going to be a tension with these countries in the sense that there's going to be a push for India to move to the East as well?
Thank you.
Also in terms of when you talk about defense and the defensive posture, if China is intending, or if India thinks China is intending on moving into the Indian Ocean region, do you think India will, instead of waiting and staying, do you think India will also look to expand eastwards?
Thank you. Sir.
Michael House from the Foreign Office. Just picking up on the net security provider issue, and more specifically counter-piracy and sort of maritime crime in the region. Is there a role now in the future for India to take a leading role in those sort of operations? Is there appetite in India to do so? And if not, what is your view on whether that opens the door to others like China taking that role on, as perhaps some countries in the West move away from those sort of operations?
Thank you. And finally, Viraj Solanki.
Thank you very much. Australia is keen on joining the Malabar trilateral naval exercises and has requested observer status for the forthcoming exercises in July. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this and on ensuring stability in the Indian Ocean and region.
Thank you. And just before you started with responses, can I also ask you very briefly for your comments on the possible opportunity there would be as of last year, stemming from the now existence of an India-US maritime dialogue and the concomitant existence also of an India-China dialogue. What does this mean for stability in the Indian Ocean?
Okay, let me start with the last question, since you're my host. You go first. On India, PRC, maritime, and U.S.-India maritime, the Navy in the United States has been the lead military and defense player in improving relations with India, which is something of an irony because the U.S. Navy most saw India as a potential problem during the Cold War. But U.S. Navy thinking seeks to do more and more with India for the obvious reasons, hence the net security provider, etc. I think the India PRC maritime discussions will be much more difficult. I've been in London for the last couple of days, so I haven't had a chance to really sift through and detail what happened with this recent piracy exercise in which the Indians put out a statement saying they worked with the Chinese PLAN to help save a ship, and the Chinese didn't mention it, and it's hard to know. I don't know. I haven't seen any, sort of material on it which would allow me to make a decision. But what I bring that out is it shows you the systematic difference. We're talking about ASW, aircraft carrier stuff, and maritime exercises, and steering groups, and Navy-to-Navy talks, and India and China are still talking about whether they helped each other with a counter-piracy mission or not. And it gives you a sense of the difference. And the Indians seem to be in a very different place with the U.S. Navy today than they were, say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago. So I think they're very different dialogues. Could they come together? I guess it's theoretically possible on some HADR issues or on maybe some counter-piracy issues, but it's hard to tell. Australia on Malabar, look, I spent a lot of time in Australia. I think Australians are really mixed about a lot of stuff right these days. They are, this is on the record, but yeah, I think the Australians want to do stuff like that, and then they get nervous about China, and they also decide whether it's going to be useful to them to do such a quadrilateral. And this has come and gone. I mean, they've shifted back and forth about this. There's a kind of ongoing debate, as you well know, in Australia about where they want to be and where their equities lie. I think there's very little debate within the Australian government system and the Defense Department in Australia about where they want to be. But I think in the larger society and the politics of Australia, there's clearly what we Americans would call a China debate in Australia. What's not at issue is maybe an Asia debate about Australia, which is even kind of telling. It's more about China and the U.S. versus Asia. So I don't know where they're going to go on Malabar. I'm not sure how New Delhi and Tokyo will feel about this. I don't know how it's necessary for Australia to be or not be in Malabar compared to the trilateral that they're trying to develop between Tokyo, Delhi, and Canberra. So, let's see. Let's watch this space. But we've been here before in 2007, and then it comes and goes, and the relative levels of interest kind of change depending on circumstances. On the question from our colleague at FCO, look, I don't think India is going to have the capacity to lead counter-piracy. I think one thing the Indians are going to be very keen on is they're not going to want to be part of CMC, right? Combined Maritime Forces, CMF, Combined Maritime Forces. Whether it's Task Force 150, 151, or 152, the Indians have said no, right? They're not going to operate under that system. So they've taken their own, patrolling, their own role in this. Most recently, as you know, in redefining the high-risk area of piracy away from India because of the insurance rates on Indian commercial shipping. So that's been a big driver for them. Now, I think the Indians will play a piracy role, but it'll be integrated. Someone asked an earlier question, I think our colleague from LSE, about the commercial intersection. There's the infrastructure component, and there's the new FICI study on how Indian companies want to play in the Indian Ocean. I think where you'll see the counter-piracy element increase is dependent on where Indian private sector goes in terms of their investments and business enterprises in the Indian Ocean. And that's something, we're watching. It's quite an interesting short 8-page survey by FICI, Federation of Indian Commerce and Industry, on Indian commercial enterprise thinking about where they want to be involved in Indian Ocean commercial business. And it's worth looking at because I do think India's Navy and maritime support for counter-piracy will be in some way affected by that. You'll note also that when Indians in the MOD report talk about their cooperation with Seychelles, Mauritius, and Maldives, they talk largely, they have it in the same section as counter-piracy operations. They don't have it in terms of capacity building or deterrence or war fighting or sphere of influence or anything. They have it in counter-piracy. So I think you'll see, as part of this defense buildup that I talked about for Seychelles, Maldives, and Mauritius, more counter-piracy. And if you look at the number of operational deployments that Indian naval ships have had in this region, they've increased. So I don't know about leading role, but I think that may be more of a role in these. But they'll be tied to commercial elements and they'll be tied to specific geographies. On the pushing India east, look, in all of those ways, these aren't either or. India's diplomatic, political, economic, civilian nuclear deal relationships, whether it's buying US-2s eventually from Japan, maybe, these are all going to increase. But from an American point of view, the reset buttons in East Asia are the following. One, the Korean Peninsula. Both maritime and land, right? The Korean Peninsula. Two, cross straits. And three, the East China Sea, meaning Japan's administrative control of the Senkaku/Diaoyu, right? Whatever you think about the disputes, from an American point of view, we've got skin in the game. We are committed and have trotted out our alliance commitments to those three strategic flashpoints. South China Sea is something a little bit different vis-a-vis Scarborough claims of Philippines. There's quite a different alliance commitment to that position. I find it not very credible in any near-term strategic scenario to have India operating in those three reset strategies: Korean Peninsula, cross straits, or East China Sea. So if you mean on naval side, the answer would be not that I can foresee any Indian role. But in terms of trade, economics, defense relations, exercises, operations, ship visits, diplomacy, I think there's going to be a lot more Indian relations with Southeast and East Asia. And you can already see the trend line increasing.
Thank you. I'd like to draw a line here. We are over time, so I won't attempt to summarise what we said, but I think it's fair to say that that's been a very stimulating conversation, and I have to say it's excellent that we've been able to afford the time to look at those issues in some detail. We hope to come back to those issues in future meetings, and you'll be welcome to attend those. Before I turn to you to express your gratitude to our speaker today, I'd like to also invite you to come back to us next time you're in London. I believe you're a frequent visitor or regular visitor, so it'll be a pleasure to see you again. So on this note, I'd like to thank you and close our session today.
Thank you very much.